Well, good morning and welcome everybody one more time to Encounter Church. We are so glad that you're here, especially if this is your first time at Encounter or just to church in general. This is a perfect time to start making church like this regular rhythm, a habit in your life, because we're starting a new series today that I'm super pumped about. It's like, preacher getting excited about the Christmas season. It's kind of stereotypical, but we're going to lean into it. It's called Gifted, and just as a part of this series, you were handed one of these cards at the door with a promise to explain a little bit more about that later. What we're doing is we're trying to cover Grand Rapids with thousands and thousands of random acts of kindness, just to simply say, hey, you are gifted. This could look like, paying for the coffee of the person behind you, or maybe if you're a kid, like babysitting for somebody, but instead of receiving payment for babysitting, you could like hand them one of these cards and say, you've been gifted this random act of kindness. And on the back, this is my favorite part, it says that I hope this random act of kindness reminds you that somebody notices and cares about you. It's not because of anything you did or didn't do. It's because you matter. You have incredible value and worth. And then an invitation, share your story at encounterchurch.org/gifted. Just out of curiosity, we did this last year as well. How many of you remember, just put your hands up, do you remember doing this? Not did you participate or anything, did you just remember? A few more hands go up with that second part. You remember doing this last year. So the cool thing about this is that during the Christmas Eve worship experiences, we share these stories. So make sure to come to that one because it's just going to be really, really incredible. It's a powerful time seeing what God is up to with all these stories of generosity and kindness that we're sharing, of gifting. But, and I never said this on stage before, but we actually kept getting stories even after this campaign ended last year. But it wasn't Christmas time, so it was kind of like awkward to share those. But it's Christmas time again now, so I can share them. One of the stories, one of you took one of these cards last year and went to the Grand Valley State University Pew Campus Library, whoever you are, and you took a card with $5 and tucked it in the book that you had checked out, and then put it back. Well, somebody later on that semester checked that same book out, got the card along with a $5 bill. And I know that because they took the time to share their story, send it into the church office to say, I don't know who you people are at Encounter Church, but you've absolutely made my day. Thank you. And I'm just like, this is so cool. I love hearing those stories. I love the idea of gifts, being able to connect some of the dots of love in people's lives. You see, that's what a good gift does, right? A good gift isn't just something expensive. A good gift isn't just something elaborate. No. A good gift connects some of the dots in somebody's life to let them know that they are loved. And so the series that we're all about for this December is taking a look at some of the gifts that were given to connect the dots of God's love. Now, the gifts that we're going to do is the gifts of the wise men, sometimes called the magi, other times called the kings, but they weren't actually kings. That's sort of misleading, and it's a song we're not going to do around here, We Three Kings, because there wasn't even three kings of them either. Well, we don't know. There could have been. There could have also been 100 kings. We're not really sure. It just says that there were wise men or magi. It was a plural, and we just sort of assume, hey, there's three gifts, so there's probably three kings or magi to go along with it, but the Bible doesn't actually say that. Let's go to the Bible right now, Matthew chapter 2, verse 11. If I could just get that on the screen behind me. If you know what the gifts are, when I read it, let's just all say it together. Then they, this is the wise men, opened their treasures when they met Jesus, and they presented him, that's Jesus, with the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. You remember the stories too. Those were the gifts that they gave to Jesus. Now, a note on some of those, okay? Because a good gift, remember, connects all the dots. In the Bible, I am thoroughly convinced, is written by one author using many people, one author of God, using many people to write it over thousands of years. And so some of the dots that get connected are just incredible. Many of you were around for our series called Brave that we kicked off the fall season with. It was a story about Daniel. Daniel, remember, stood up. He was brave for God when nobody else was, and it cost him a lot. He was constantly in trouble by the people around him. Even though they didn't like him, they respected him. And so by the time his story came to an end, by the time Daniel died and passed on and the story continued, they didn't like him, but they maintained the traditions that he had. They maintained the work, the project that he was working on. And one of those significant projects was Daniel saying, listen, a time is coming, literally when the stars are aligning, that's going to be your sign that a king is going to be born. Now, you're not going to know, like, how significant this king is, but let me tell you, like, he is the king of all kings. He is the one that human history will be divided on before or after BC AD, right? He is going to be the one that is going to mark, like, the linchpin, the significant event that human history is going to turn on. Like, that's the magnitude of this event. And so even though they didn't like Daniel, they still respected him enough to continue looking and watching and waiting for the sign. And then 600 years after the time of Daniel, the Magi, those wise men as they were called, the astrologers, they looked up and they saw that the stars were aligned. And they knew a king had been born. And so they packed up what they had, and they set off on the months-long journey, and they brought those gifts along with them. When they met Jesus, they bowed down, they worshiped him, and they presented him the gifts that were so incredibly appropriate for the king that he was, of gold and of frankincense and of myrrh. And even though those wise men, those magi, had no clue, could not have had any idea just what the significance of those gifts were, I think God knew, because I think God was in the business of connecting those dots. And throughout this gifted series, we're taking a look at the significance of those gifts. That the gift of gold is so significant for the birth of Jesus because Jesus is the gift of a king, and you give kings gold. Frankincense, whatever that is, we're going to hear it next week, is the gift of God, the gift of a Lord, and myrrh, the gift of a Savior. But today's gift, though, is so controversial, is so contentious. Today's gift is so divisive that it even made one local global ruler, one king, absolutely, completely lose his mind. And it's the gift of gold. Now, I want to give you a heads up because I don't want you to be surprised by it later on when we get to it and said, he tricked me. It was just an interesting story that he was telling me. And then all of a sudden, bait and switched it on me. I just want to tell you right up front that today's story, it's going to demand your attention. I think it's going to even demand your decision. Because today we're going to take a look at who Jesus is, the gift of gold, and we're going to see he's not just anybody. He's somebody. He's not just any king. He's the king. And we have to make a decision about how we're going to respond to him in light of that fact. So listen to the story. It comes from Matthew chapter 2. By the way, on the program, there's a Bible passage listed out there. That's entirely not the Bible passage we're going to talk about this morning. I'll preach on it. Stick around for a while. Someday I'll preach on that one, just not today. I tell you that, I just don't want you to blame our communications team or anything for this. This is totally on me. This is a dark fail, all right? But Matthew 2, you can help with the page number and then turn back. Matthew 2 is where we're going to kick it off in verse 1. There's Bibles underneath the chairs in front of you if you want to follow along. And by the way, always, if you don't have a Bible or if you just like ours better, take it. We love that. We give them away all the time. Can't steal it because we gave it to you. Okay, so it says, in verse 1, after Jesus, setting us in history here, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, now to pause right there because immediately we see this tension set up on the scene, right? That we've been talking about Jesus as if he was the king because you give kings the gift of gold like he had received, we just heard. But there's another king. There's King Herod. And so you have this showdown, this tension already in the story because, hey, Bethlehem is only big enough, for one king. Judea is only big enough for one king. And it's who's it going to be? The smart money is on Herod, especially at this time. Jesus' baby, maybe a toddler, he was just born. Herod already had a significant resume behind him about what made him a great king. In fact, they even called him Herod the Great, because he was that great. And he rolled with some pretty great people. Just to give you some historical context on this, because I love anchoring these stories in actual human history. It's not far away in a galaxy long, long ago in Bible land. No, this is like actual historical stuff, and it's like anchored with real people. Herod the Great rolled with some pretty great people. One of them was Cleopatra, right? Some of you remember in like history class, Anthony and Cleopatra down in Egypt. He's not too far away in modern day Israel. And Herod strikes a deal with Cleopatra so that they can run as a monopoly the asphalt business primarily out of the Dead Sea, which is really like profitable because he would actually like use the asphalt and they would seal up ships, right? Because the wood and they like patch all the holes so that it like hold waters. You could say that he made a boatload of money. Thank you. You're welcome. I'll be here all week. Right. You clap for that? Are you kidding? All right. Now I know my audience. It's good to know. Okay. He also teamed up with Emperor Octavian at one point. The Emperor of Rome he leased a copper mine from the island of Cyprus. I just want you to see, Herod the Great rolled with some pretty great people. He did some pretty great things. He stepped into Jerusalem, his capital city, and one of the things was he decided, you know what, if this is going to be my capital, this has to be, in his words, right, this has to be a city worthy of my dignity and my stature. And so he set out on all these improvements of the city, right, where he expanded it, he rebuilt some buildings to it. In fact, he rebuilt the temple so extravagantly and elaborately that the people unofficially started calling it Herod's Temple. I mean, like, oh man, a temple? Are you kidding me? But that's like the kind of guy he was. He wanted to make sure that everybody knew he was great. He was a great builder. He was a great partner. He was a great king. He was also greatly troubled. I mean, he was paranoid. He had countless sons, nephews murdered because he saw them as threats to the throne. He changed his will something like 4 or 5 times because he was worried that somebody was coming after him. He had one of his wives murdered. I mean, it's such a deeply troubled individual. One historian, so like outside of the Bible, kind of like just historian, like looking at some of the records, the public records at the time that we have now, I looked at this and said Herod was very much the evil genius of the Judean nation. In fact, went on to say that Herod was the kind of guy who would commit any crime, do anything necessary in order to maintain his rule above all else. That's Herod. That's Herod the Great that is now being set up in stark contrast to this new king, baby Jesus, that had just been born. You kind of wonder, like, how's he going to react to the news of these magi coming in town with what they're about to say? Let's read on in the story, and it says this. It says that the magi came from, the east, right, and came to Jerusalem, the capital city, and they asked, where is the one who has been born, can you just imagine, been born King of the Jews? I mean, like, friend, they must have been from out of town because you don't just go to Herod, go into the palace, right? Like knock on the door, open it up, get a throne room. You see Herod sitting on the throne, Herod the Great, Herod the King. He's sitting on the throne where kings sit, and then asking like, hey, heard there was a king. Have you met him? I mean, Herod, right? He's losing his mind at this point. So if you could, just kind of with me, we're going to connect some of these dots a little bit later. You see what I'm doing here? It's just kind of like if you're the note-taking kind of person, or like if you like to mark up your Bible, it's just a circle that like line King of the Jews, because we're going to come back to that. At this point, like Herod is losing his mind, right? Everybody around him knows like he is not going to take this well. And in fact, he doesn't. The next line is they continue, he goes, we saw his star when it arose, and we have come to worship him. Now when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Okay, some context on that, because I think it may have been an understatement. He was disturbed. This story is written, I know it looks like words on a screen behind me. It's totally like void of like paper and like a story outside of this. But like if you have a Bible, you kind of like hold that and like, these are real words written on real paper. In fact, it's written by somebody named Matthew. And Matthew was writing this specifically for the Jewish people, many of them living in Jerusalem, the capital city. And they knew who Herod was, the good and the evil of him. And so when they hear the story that Matthew is telling, as some guests from the east saying, hey, I heard there was a king that's been born. And when Matthew says, yeah, and Herod was disturbed by it. The listeners of this story are like freaking out right now. And they're like, Herod has just like been issued this direct threat, like shots fired, everybody. There's another king that has been born, and Herod is going to lose his mind. And he is disturbed. But all of Jerusalem along with him, because all of Jerusalem knew exactly what he was capable of. In fact, history shows that Herod the Great, Herod the King, had killed so many Jewish rabbis, the religious teachers. Jesus was one of them when he grew up later on. He had killed so many rabbis that they had stopped going to Jerusalem altogether if they could avoid it. They just avoided the capital city because that's where Herod was. He just went around the city and you just get like shivers, right? Like, whoa, man, this is not a safe place because of King Herod. And now he's disturbed. He's evil, but he's also an evil genius. So he comes up with this plan, right? And so he, a couple of verses, he gets it together. In verse 7, he says, hey, we see that Herod called the Magi secretly because he's an evil genius, and he found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, and he said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. And it's like, anybody who knows King Herod knows he's not going to go worship him. But that's just the point. They're from out of town. They don't know King Herod. Just a note on like this worship, right? Because we have to know what Herod is absolutely, no matter what, not going to do. If I could be honest, most of the time, when we think about what it means to worship, what that means is that we come into church, we pick out our spot. You all have spots. I know, I see you, the same spots every week. I do the same, right? This is my spot right up here, and I worship, right? We put the words on the screen. The band comes out to lead us in worship, and we worship. I love it so much. I come twice every single week. I'd encourage you guys too. But right, like I'm here, and if you're wondering, like, whose hand is that in the air, right? Like in front all the time, that's me, because this is my like worship spot. This is where God shows up to me on a weekend to weekend basis consistently, and I love that. But this time of worship isn't where worship begins. It isn't even where worship ends. But this time of worship, you could say, is a time of, or a kind of worship that is meant to like reorientate my entire life around what matters most, which is Jesus. Him glorified, him crucified, his forgiveness, his righteousness put on me. That's what matters most. And so this time of worship functions as a reorientation of my entire week around that central principle. Now, we tend to think that worship happens just one time, but now here we see the Magi coming up, the wise men coming up, and they're going to worship this baby Jesus with their gifts. Now, I don't think that what they mean by that is like they're going to put words on a screen or a handout or something and like get their like harp and lyre out and they're just going to like worship him in that setting. No. I think what they have in mind is something more than that. Something that I know, and you know now, Herod is never going to do. And the kind of worship that I'm talking about, a specific kind of worship, and to do this, I'm going to go, this is like something in speech class, like you never do because it's so cliche, but Webster's dictionary defines worship, as some of you in Toastmasters are like, oh, this is killing me. No. Webster's dictionary in 1829 is where we're going, so that's kind of unique, defines worship, and I love this, as extravagant love, and the part that I appreciate most is extreme submission. Like that's the part, that's the worship that those kings or magi, wise men from the east have come. They have come to lay down their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And here gold, representing the king that they are meeting for the first time. And here they are going to lay down not only their gifts, but also themselves and submitting themselves to extreme submission to this, the baby king. And that is something that Herod just cannot and will not wrap his mind around. In fact, he doesn't. In fact, in the next few lines in verse 13, when they had gone, that's the wise men, the magi, when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said. Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child and kill him. And he did. It's been come to recognize in history as the night of the massacre of the innocents. And Herod went to the village of Bethlehem. It's about 5 miles from Jerusalem, the capital city, and he knocked on every single door, and he found every single kid looking for Jesus. Keep in mind, Bethlehem is a small town, teeny little village. There are almost certainly more people in the room today than the entire village of Bethlehem at the time. Like, the soldiers came around. They found every single kid looking for Jesus, but he was an evil genius. He never saw coming the fact that an angel would come and warn Joseph, Jesus' I don't know, it's like stepdad or something. I'm not sure what the definition is on that one, but like warn his parents to flee, to get out of there, right? To go to Egypt, settle in the city of Alexandria, where there was a huge Jewish expatriate community living there. All of them, by the way, were fleeing Herod the Great, Herod the evil genius, Herod the king, because he was clamping down on all of it. So they fled out of there. And by the way, if you have like this special heart or this special like nudging inside of you to care for people's displaced, for people's living as refugees in foreign lands, like we've partnered up with Bethany Christian Services to resettle refugees here in West Michigan. It's been an awesome journey for that one. But like if you have, like, you should kind of like resonate with this story, right? That's why your heart maybe does that, because our God and our King was a refugee, a displaced person himself, waiting out the time until Herod died and they could move back. And this time when they moved back to the place that is so far from the political life. They moved back not to Jerusalem or even Bethlehem. They moved back to the country bumpkin town of Nazareth, of all places. And it's there that Jesus grows up. You know, I don't think they talked much about Jesus, the King, in his growing up years, at least not in front of him. But Jesus grew up, and he started studying what we know as the Old Testament, the law, the Torah, they called it. And he started becoming an expert in it. He started being recognized as an expert in it. He started making day trips to Jerusalem. Remember, it's not that far away. And so he'd go to Jerusalem, and he would impress the leaders in the temple, and then he'd go back again, and then he'd go back, and then he'd come home again. And pretty soon he himself was recognized as one of those religious leaders, as one of those rabbis. And he brought a message that was so radical, that was so world-changing, that was so epitomizing of the events surrounding his birth, that the leadership at the time hated him for it, because they were hell-bent on maintaining power and control no matter what, not unlike Herod the Great, Herod the King. And they ended up killing him for it. Now, some of you recognize the story. They took the thorn branches, and they twisted it into a crown, and they put purple on him, and they dug the thorns into his brow until he bled, and then they mocked him. They mocked him as the king, right? And if we could continue just connecting the dots, when they strung him up on a cross and nailed him there to die for all of the little terrible Herods of the world, like each one of us, when they put him there, it was Herod. It wasn't Herod the Great. It was his son, Herod Antipas, Herod the Tetrarch, who had a sign made that wrote, "King of the Jews," above his head. Because God is in the business of connecting the dots to demonstrate his profound love for any one of us. He made good on that declaration foretold at his birth, and also 600 years before then. But that's not even the main point I want to make today. But the point is, I guess, like as evil as Herod is, like, I get him. Right? There's something in it that, like, this makes sense. Right? The part of it, I guess, that I struggle with, that I look kind of in a twisted, sick way up to Herod, even though he did unforgivable things, is that at least he understood the significance of the time that he was living in. At least he understood the rivalry that Jesus the King was setting up to himself as a king. You see, he saw Jesus for who Jesus really was, a rival king who has come to dethrone him, maybe not in a political, literal sense, but come to dethrone him and say, Herod, you are not in charge of your kingdom. You are not even in charge of your life. Jesus says, I, as the king of all kings, I am in charge of you and everyone else because I am the king of creation itself. Here's why I kind of get Herod, why I fear him, I respect him, I hate him all at the same time. Is because what we have done is we've taken the words of Jesus, we've taken the life of Jesus, and it's everything that came before, like the red letters, let's say, right here. We've taken everything before and we like hacked it off. And we've forgotten that Jesus was the Word at creation. We've forgotten that Jesus was the one by whom all things were made that has been made. And that he is the one, in him, all things hold together. And we've like cut that off in the beginning. And then we've taken everything after those red letters of Jesus. We've taken everything after, especially on into the book of Revelation, how it ends. And we see that Jesus has come back on the clouds the same way that he left in the first place. He comes back and he sits on a throne of not just heaven, but now heaven and earth. And every square inch of this creation that he has made, he is now reigning and ruling over. But we've like lost that. And we've looked at Jesus and say, let's just boil this down, distill this down to just these red letters of Jesus. You know what he is? He's a great moral teacher. You know, I look at these words and they give me a way to lead the best possible life I can lead. They give me a way to do good. And he is all of those things. But he is also so much more than that. He's a king. And Jesus has called us not just to follow his advice. He's calling us to follow him as a king, right? And Herod, for all of his faults, Herod, for everything evil that he has ever done, Herod at least realized that. And he didn't try to pretend that Jesus was anything other than a king. And Herod knew what it meant to have a king and to be a king. Herod understood that when you have a king, everything that you think you have doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the king. Herod understood that when you have a king, the king always comes first. That it's almost like you take out your checkbook and you write a blank check of your life. Nobody uses checks anymore. That analogy falls. Herod understood that having a king means like handing over your Venmo account and saying, everything that I have is now yours. Herod got that. Herod understood that having a king means that the king comes first. The king comes above career. The king comes above finances. The king comes above family, even kids. The king always comes first. And Herod at least saw it and hated him for it. But at least he didn't try to pretend that Jesus was something that he was not, simply a good teacher. And so the decision that I think all of this forces is that Jesus said that he's a king, the sign declared both at his birth and at his death. And so it's on each one of us to respond and to ask, do you recognize him as the king of your life, as sitting on the throne of your heart, that everything you have is now his? Are you going to fall into line with that? Or are you going to pretend that he's someone that he said he's not? Or are you going to hate him for it? I think you have an opportunity to respond like Herod and try to dethrone him as intensely as you possibly can, or like the Magi. When they saw the star that they've been waiting for 600 years, they pack up the gifts, they pack up their stuff, they travel for months simply to come and lay it down before him in an exercise of extreme submission. Now, before you answer in your own mind of which of these sides you're going to take, loathe him or love him, Herod or the Magi, I encourage you to just think about what happens in the story afterwards. Herod, he doesn't go away. He wanted so badly to be remembered. He wanted so badly for a legacy to remain, and he got his wish. We're still talking about him thousands of years after his death. Except we don't talk about him the way he wanted to be talked about. We don't remember him as Herod the builder. We remember him as Herod the murderer. He's not Herod the great, he's Herod the terrible, Herod the evil. But most of all, we remember Herod by someone who was living so close to the most important event of human history, that Herod was living and sleeping just 5 miles away from the birth of God. And Herod had such an incredible opportunity to deny his own kingdom and serve Jesus. And Herod had this choice to make about whether or not he was going to serve my kingdom or thy kingdom. And he chose himself. And now we look back and it was so short-sighted. And so before you choose about whether you loathe him or love him, it's Herod or it's the Magi, before you choose how you respond to this Christmas message of the gift of Jesus as King, think about this. Think about how you have the opportunity, like Herod did, of living and being a part of something so much bigger and so much wider and so much longer lasting than just you. That you have the opportunity this Christmas of living for a kingdom that is going to outlast your career and outlast your finances and outlast your kids and your grandkids and those grandkids. That you've got an opportunity to take everything that you have, package it up in a gifts of like gold, frankincense, and myrrh, lay it at the feet of Jesus this Christmas and say, not my will, but thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Because I accept the gift of King Jesus in my life. I hope you make that choice today, this week, this Christmas. And I want to give you the opportunity to make that choice right now. In just a few minutes, we're going to celebrate communion together. And we're going to take a part of this ancient meal. It's 2,000 years old. When Jesus hung out with some of his friends, his disciples, in an upstairs apartment in Jerusalem on the time of Passover, a Jewish holiday. And we're going to pass around bread and take some and drink a little cup of juice. And when we do this act, I encourage you to think about it this way. And when that bread slides in front of you, by taking that bread, you are declaring with one voice that Jesus is not just a king, but my king. And I give my king my life, my kingdom for his. And if you're not ready to do that right now, if you're not ready to declare Jesus as king, that is okay. You let that plate slide right by. But if you're brand new to church, if you're brand new to here, listen, if you're brand new to this faith, and you sense like, yeah, I want somebody else in the driver's seat of my life. I want to hand over my life to his no more. What that means, take communion with us. Declare he is your king with us. And then tell me about it. Come up to me afterwards, and I want to pray with you. Shoot me an email later this week, today, if you'd like. I want to pray with you from a distance, like whatever it is, because we want to celebrate that we all have a king. I invite you to stand up. Let's pray together. Jesus, we come to you in complete awe of your majesty, God, because you're not just a teacher, You're not just a spiritual leader. You didn't come just to give us religious or spiritual principles and truths. You came with a kingdom behind you. May we not settle for pat answers. May we pursue you as the God of it all, as the ruler of creation itself. And as we come into you, your presence, we recognize here that we are in a throne room. And in fact, this throne room for this moment right now where you are, this looks like that apartment in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, where you taught us how to eat, how to live, how to receive grace, and simply be under your kingship in your kingdom. Jesus, it's in your name we pray. Amen.